I was thinking here how interesting it might have been when you all entered this room if we had asked each of you to vote before hearing anything here, whether you were for or against using the Article 5 convention option. I would have found that very interesting because if you were a representative group of American citizens, I can tell you that after working on this issue for a number of years and following it extremely closely, particularly on the internet, 80 or 90% of you would have voted against the Article 5 convention, because that is in fact the reality out there in the real country that we live in. And so I'm very much preoccupied these days with trying to figure out how do we get the first Article 5 convention, and how do we win the war by beating the opposition. Now, the opposition is out there. It's very clear. Well, here's the first fact that I want to emphasize about America. Americans overwhelmingly say they love and respect the Constitution, and usually specific amendments. Now, the people on the left love different amendments than the people on the right, but they all say they love even some amendments. I have conceived of three frameworks for trying to understand why most Americans oppose using the Article 5 convention option in the Constitution. Two of them have been used, and I'm going to introduce a third framework that has not yet been used, and I think we ought to use it. First, I will briefly explain the two that have not worked successfully. And the first framework I call the craziness framework, because many Americans have been taught to fear using the convention option, even though it has never been used. I emphasize that word taught, because fearing an Article 5 convention is not in our genetic makeup. There's no reason to think that fearing the convention comes naturally. It is an unnatural sort of point of view. It is an irrational point of view. This is like, as I say in the paper, which I have copies of you if you're interested later, being afraid of the convention is like being afraid to eat the fruit of the constitutional tree first planted by the founders, even though no one has ever tasted or been harmed by the fruit. It's irrational. It's crazy. Now, if those people, though, who fear the convention think they are acting rationally, it is delusional thinking. And, it's all based on some imaginary possibility of what might happen if we had the convention. Such people, I want to emphasize, have been purposefully and successfully brainwashed, because a number of organizations for a very long period of time have implanted this fear in the public consciousness. And so the result is we have a large fraction of Americans who have, I would call, an emotional block to convening the first Article 5 convention. It's emotional. It's based on fear. It's very hard to beat this kind of thing. Very, very difficult. And I don't think we've succeeded in being able to remove this fear, which is now so embedded in the public consciousness. The second framework I call the analytic framework. And most Americans who oppose the convention think that they are using rational, substantive arguments. In fact, we, the proponents and advocates for a convention, use facts based on, as Bill has done in a great way, the language in Article 5 or other historical facts to objectively contradict wrong-headed thinking. But correcting the record has not worked sufficiently, largely because opponents invent their own facts, ignore correct facts, and consume disinformation. Disinformation that is purposefully put out there into the public realm by various organizations on the left and the right. We have bipartisan opposition to using the Article 5 convention option. Why do people block correct information? Well, for many years I studied psychology, and there's something called cognitive dissonance. When you hear something that is not consistent with your original thinking, You block it out because it's too painful to say, well, I was wrong. I believed the wrong information all these years. So this is just a known psychological problem. So people in this framework have an intellectual block that's psychologically reinforced, and it prevents the acceptance of correct information. I want to emphasize that we should not invite, respect, or participate in arguments by opponents that fit these two frameworks. Either they're crazy, irrational, or they are blocking out correct information because they've been brainwashed. Why participate or think you should participate in rational discussions with such people? We should, in particular, recognize and condemn morally, I emphasize morally, offensive fear-mongering used intentionally by convention opponents. This is a tactic that they have used for years. They know what they are doing. They want to make Americans afraid of using the Article 5 Convention options. So changing these two frameworks is a paradigm change. I used to be a professor, by the way, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I used to teach a lot about paradigm changes. And paradigm changes are really very, very difficult, take a long time. You know, we've only been working, people like Bill and myself, a decade at most. This is not long for a paradigm change. They can take a very long period of time. But what's interesting to me historically is that right now in the United States, we have an unusually high level of dissatisfaction with government, politicians, and both major political parties. I think it's historic in my lifetime. I'm 71, and I tell you, I've been involved in policy and politics all my adult life. I find this situation right now extremely interesting, and I think it justifies us continuing our work as advocates for an Article 5 convention, but it also, in my mind, raises the need for a new framework to beat the opposition, because I consider myself a student of movements. I've been associated with all kinds of movements in my life. Most of them fail, and they don't fail because people don't have the greatest intentions and the right ideas and the right goals. They fail because people who run movements always underestimate the opposition, and they don't have a plan of attack to figure out how to beat the opposition. So here's my third framework, how to beat the opposition to an Article 5 convention. I call it the patriotic framework. It gets to the root of the problem from a rule of law perspective. Rather than condemn convention opponents as irrational or ignorant, which they are in my view, we condemn them instead as unpatriotic constitutional hypocrites. I'll say it again. Unpatriotic constitutional hypocrites. Because remember, everyone says they love the Constitution. And then you bring up Article 5, well, no, we don't love that part of it. That's hypocritical. With the patriotic framework, we take advantage of very strong public support for specific constitutional amendments, and you may hear more about it. It's really fascinating because at various times in the history of the country, there has been incredible public support for specific amendments, by the way, which Congress never proposed. And I went back and did a little research, quick research. 1996, 74% of Americans favored an amendment to limit the number of terms for members of Congress. 74%. That's amazing. In 2005, 76% favored an amendment to allow prayer in public schools. In '83, it was 81%. It's always about the same number. Numbers, by the way, that rival support for politicians running in campaigns, typically, or a winning fraction for election. And there's more and more data along these lines for popular public support for specific amendments that Congress never proposes.